She contributed all she had. This would be a good stewardship Sunday homily time. Father Patrick obviously didn't want to give it. They say you cannot judge a book by its cover. I'm not sure who said that first, but somebody said it a long time ago. Almost all of us say it from time to time now. And over the last several Sundays, we've heard about loving God and loving neighbor, readings and homilies that have dealt not only with that we're supposed to love God and love our neighbor, but also how we might go about doing some of that. We're supposed to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, meaning we can't forget self-love in this equation. Father Gary recently stood in this spot to say that in loving ourselves, we need to accept all of ourselves, even the parts we don't like, maybe especially the parts we don't like, because it all belongs. And a couple of weeks ago, Father Patrick talked about the blind man, Bartimaeus, who got to hear Jesus ask him the question, "What do you want me to do for you?" And whose answer was brief and to the point when he said, "I want to see." So as we pick things up today, I want to suggest that truly seeing and accepting ourselves, as well as truly seeing and accepting others, is probably really important to following that commandment to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. I think today's reading suggests that seeing ourselves and others as we are in our entirety may be the key step in that process. Looking and really seeing. And looking beyond the surface whenever possible so that we don't end up judging that book by its cover. If we're not careful, if we don't look closely, if we only glance at the book's cover, we might see the scribes in their long robes sitting in places of honor and think, well, those guys are the model. Let's do what they do. And like the disciples, we might not see the widow at all. Her 2 coins may look insignificant, especially compared to the much larger amounts of money that others give, but she gives what she has. She gives what she is. But until Jesus points her out, nobody notices. He wants us to see her and to recognize her gift. The same goes for that widow of Zarephath in today's first reading. She agrees to give Elijah some water in the midst of a drought and to feed him some bread in the midst of a famine. All she has is a handful of flour and a little bit of oil. Before Elijah showed up, she'd been planning to make some bread, and then who knows, she and her son might have starved. But like the poor widow in the gospel, this woman gives everything, all that she has, all that she is, and it turns out to be enough to take care of Elijah, her son, and herself for a long time. I think the readings remind us that God can take what we offer and do great things. But I think there's a corollary to that, which is that when our neighbors, like these widows, share their gifts, one of our jobs is to really look and really see them so that we can recognize those gifts. Like the blind Bartimaeus of a couple of weeks ago, we've been given the gift to see, to notice what's in front of us. And with that comes the responsibility not to pigeonhole those that we see, to put them into boxes and file them into categories that make them less than what they truly are. Oh, he's the guy with the nice car. By the way, Ed, great car. He drove a Corvette today. Or she's the woman with all the kids. He's the math whiz. She's the one who always volunteers to help at the CSC. That sort of shorthand shortchanges a person's humanity. Labels actually, I think, can help us recognize some of what others are, but those labels also can prevent us from seeing. The disciples might have seen scribes dropping cash into the treasury and thought, those are the folks to emulate. But it was the widow offering herself, the person who they didn't even notice, who gave the best gift. She serves the God who asks us to bring what we have to the task at hand, to offer ourselves, to know something about ourselves. We learn who we are by honestly looking at ourselves, accepting what we see, all of it. But it sure helps when others see us, when others who love us reflect that love back to us and show us what we are. As the fictional soccer coach / philosopher Ted Lasso says, it's not about the wins and the losses. It's about helping these young fellas be the best versions of themselves on and off the field. But just as we rely on others to help reveal parts of us to us, we also owe it to them to see who they are so that we can reflect that back to them. Maybe nobody recognizes that widow's gift because they don't really see her. She's just a poor widow. They put her into that box and they're done. And since we're talking about widows, I also want to talk about marriage for a moment, because a big part of that sacrament involves seeing and revealing and giving ourselves to one another, about truly seeing and loving our spouse. I also need to mention marriage because I don't want to steal any thunder from Father Patrick at the end of Mass, but I know of a wedding anniversary that's coming this week. It's coming tomorrow, in fact, ours. Jenny and I will have been married 36 years tomorrow. And I said that not to get applause, but because I was thinking about the widows and their willingness to give everything, and that reminded me of marriage, because married people are called to give everything, to honestly share our strengths, our complexities, and our contradictions, and to accept them in our beloved. I, for instance, am more than just a guy who occasionally likes to wear a white dress. Sometimes I'm a selfish jerk. Sometimes I'm extremely thoughtful and generous. Sometimes I make Ginny laugh. Sometimes I drive her crazy. Sometimes I do all those things at once. I, like all of us, am wonderfully made, but I'm not always wonderful to live with. Same for Ginny. Same for all of us. And you know, before the widows from today's readings were widows, they had to have been wives. I mean, marriage was different in those days, but I'd expect those women also celebrated anniversaries and argued and laughed with their husbands. They lived in a family. They weren't always lonely widows, you know. When I was a young kid, probably 12 or 13, I got a job cutting grass for an older woman who was a widow. And this woman was every second of 80, if not older, and she lived by herself in a house that I think had been last decorated around the time of World War II. And she and her husband had once worked for the St. Louis Police Department. I know that because every time I finished cutting her grass, before she paid me, she made me come inside and she fed me ice cream while she told me stories about her life. And I sat in her kitchen, which seemed to be one of the only rooms she ever went into. And she watched me eat vanilla ice cream while telling stories about her days working with her husband and the police. I'm pretty sure she was lonely by herself in this house full of stuff that looked as if it hadn't been touched for years. And at the time, the young me had this idea that she'd always been this lonely woman that I saw in front of me, that she'd somehow never been young, you know? And I couldn't see that when she was telling those stories to me about her life and what it had been like years earlier, she was kind of like the widow in today's gospel. She was sharing more than ice cream or a couple of coins. She was presenting the most valuable thing she possessed, her life, herself. But just like the apostles in today's gospel, I didn't get what she was offering because I didn't really see it. Now, I'm hoping that as I've gotten older, that may have changed a little bit. For example, my mom is now in her 80s. She lives alone. Some of you may have met her when she's been here at the CSC for Mass before. Let me quickly share another quote from Ted Lasso, who said, "Boy, I love meeting people's moms. It's like reading an instruction manual as to why they're nuts." When I see my mom, I can still see what her life was like when her house was full. Like the woman whose grass I used to cut, my mom is a widow, but perhaps because I witnessed my mom's stories when the events actually were happening, I'm able to see past the book cover of her life more into the contents. I can see who and what she still is in all of her messy and complicated humanness. And I think we need to do our best to really see every time we meet someone. As many of you know, for the last 30 years, I've worked over at the School of Medicine. And since the pandemic started, I've spent less time in patient areas, but I used to be in Barnes and Children's Hospital a lot before the COVID restrictions. And something working in that environment taught me is that there's always a chance that when you get on an elevator or pass a person in a hallway, that person may be going through something. There's a chance that he has just gotten some bad news, either bad personal news or bad news about a loved one. There's also a chance that she got great news, that the scans are finally clear, or that a parent or a child's going to recover. We don't talk about those things on our elevator rides, but I always try to be aware that it's possible, even likely, that there's something going on that much more than I'm seeing could be happening in the lives of the people that I encounter each day. As I said, before the widows in Scripture were vulnerable and poor, they had lives. And those lives didn't end when their circumstances changed. The woman whose lawn I mowed was much more than the musty, dark house where she lived. And what she gave me wasn't only ice cream or a little cake of bread or 2 small coins. She gave me her life in those stories. The unfortunate thing is I didn't really take the time to see and tune into that. Now, Jenny knows my story back for almost 40 years, and I know hers. Part of the job of loving one another has been to see and embrace the truth about ourselves and each other, good and bad, and to reflect that truth back to one another. But to reflect it, we have to be aware of it. We have to see it. So my prayer today, like that of Bartimaeus a couple of weeks ago, is, Lord, I want to see. Because if we can't see, really see the reality of what's in us and what's in others, it's going to be tougher to love one another. And that's a violation of the commandments.